My name is Philip Kennedy. I'm the director of the Institute's public program. And as I've just said, it's great to see you out in numbers. I know why, because of our speaker. But I do want to introduce him nevertheless, because I know you all know who he is. Among you, I'm sure there are some who are residents here and some visitors, and of course some Emirati citizens. But whether you're a visitor or a resident or a citizen, it seems to me we're all aware of the excitement that it is to live in Abu Dhabi at the moment. The huge development plans, the ambitions, the initiatives, and of course the challenges of living here. It seems to me in the 21st century there's a kind of conspectus that exists here of the challenges, of urban challenges of the 21st century. So it's a particular pleasure to be welcoming as our guest this evening Richard Florida, who of course, as you know, is an urban study theorist and a leading intellectual on economic competitiveness and demographic trends. He was born in Newark, New Jersey. He's a New Jersey person like Frank Sinatra and Bruce Willis and Bruce Springsteen. And he lived there, studied at Rutgers University, till he crossed the river to do his PhD at Columbia. So then he came to our side of town, which is great too. Let me say a few things. I'll give you some of the many quivers in his, arrows in his quiver, excuse me. He's the director currently of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. He is the thing that we're most proud about, a global research professor at NYU, and he's currently teaching one of our intensive January term, so-called J-term classes to a group of students. I know they're all in the room because I've seen them. He is senior editor of The Atlantic. He is author of several influential global bestsellers, including the award-winning The Rise of the Creative Class, which 800 CEO read, singled out as, quote, one of the best business books of all time, end quote. His latest book, The Rise of the Creative Class Revisited, proposes a dramatic new social contract for our time, one that can turn our emerging creative economy into an enduringly creative society. He is the founder of Creative Class Group, which works closely with cities, nations, and companies worldwide. As a senior editor of The Atlantic, he writes frequently for major newspapers and appears regularly on CNN and other news broadcasts and outlets. Time magazine recognized his Twitter feed as one of the 140 most influential in the world. The Economist, has called him, quote, as close to a household name as it is possible for an urban theorist to be in America, end quote. Esquire has included him on its annual list of the best and the brightest, and Fast Company dubbed him an intellectual rock star. So, but of course, all of you are well aware that Bono quoted his book, gave it a huge plug, The Rise of the Creative Class, in front of Bill Clinton on a very exposed stage. It's a great honor, and very pleased to welcome Richard Florida.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that kind and warm introduction. It's really terrific to be here and to see all of you. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful evening. And it's spectacular to be part of NYU and NYU Abu Dhabi. It's true. You mentioned Frank Sinatra. You mentioned Bruce Willis. You mentioned Bruce Springsteen, but you didn't mention the Jersey Shore. I grew up talking like this, so what do you mean? It's so nice to be in Abu Dhabi. And then I got a Garden State Scholarship to Rutgers, where I learned English as a second language. It's true, it's true. Not many people in my family got to go to college, and I give a lot of credit to that scholarship and to wonderful, wonderful Italian immigrant parents. But here we are, a place I never thought I'd be, a place far away from New Jersey. And the reason we're here is the subject of my remarks, the role of cities, global cities, in this great world. And it's really remarkable. You know, it's really remarkable when you think about it. I tell my students here, remarkable. I mean, it's truly remarkable. I've learned, Herb Simon, the great cognitive scientist, won a Nobel Prize in economics, mathematician. He often said the great secret of the university is that we as faculty learn more from our students than they learn from us. And I learned that lesson anew. I was telling my class today that not only have I learned more from them than I try to give back to them, but I've learned more about global cities being part of two things. One, of this intensive 3-week course where we really live the problem together, but two, being in a place that is an incredible, wonderful, amazing experiment in city building. And it has taught me an incredible amount. Things I really didn't know about global cities. When I was growing up, I grew up in this small, I was born in Newark, in the, what you would call, I guess, the Italian neighborhood or the Italian ghetto. We didn't travel very far. My parents moved to a suburb. I'll use the euphemism, suburb. It was a town called North Arlington. If you ever watch The Sopranos, it's sort of the place that Tony Soprano drives through between the pizza place and the Bada Bing Club, but that's neither here nor there. And nobody moved around much, you know? My parents came to New York City. This place is 8 miles away, once. Once, 8 miles away to visit me when I was a graduate student at Columbia, because they think I needed meatballs and stuff like that. I went to Rutgers, then went to Columbia. I was never on a plane until I was 25 years of age. Even in my class at Rutgers, I was telling my students I was competing against other kids from New Jersey. I don't know what I would have done if I was competing in the market they do against really bright kids around the world. And then all of a sudden, I wake up a few decades later, and we're in this world. You know, just 3% of the world's population lived in cities a couple of centuries ago in the year 1800. By the year 1900, maybe 10 or so % of us lived in cities. Just a few years ago, we crossed this great threshold, as many of you know. Now, half of the world's population lives in cities and metropolitan areas. 3.5 billion of us. But the really interesting fact is that over the course of the next several decades, what we're witnessing here in Abu Dhabi, what you have all been through over the past 4 or 5 years or the past decade, is a period of strikingly rapid urbanization. We're going to put more people in cities in the next several decades than currently live in all the cities of the world. We're going to have moved from about half of the world's population to about 3/4 of the world's population. And the places that are going to be urbanizing are going to be doing it very rapidly, and many of them with much fewer resources than we have, well, in New York or London or right here in Abu Dhabi. And I think the challenge I want to make to you is that our challenge is not only to make our own cities great and this city great. I think we have a bigger challenge. I think of all the grand challenges to face this world, from climate change to global agriculture, all of the great problems we face, there is no grander challenge that faces the world. And I would argue there's no grander challenge in world history than how do we tackle this next wave of urbanization, and how do we build great cities. And we're starting with a blank slate. We don't have an adequate science of cities, although we're building that at NYU through a number of new centers and institutes. But more than that, it's not just the science. We don't have an adequate curriculum to understand what the rudiments of global cities are. And more than that, if in medical schools and law schools and engineering schools, they have clinical and professional and executive education programs, we have absolutely none of that. So we have to not only build the science, we have to build the methodology, we have to build the curriculum, we have to build the best practices, and we have to diffuse this at a rapid pace. And if we don't do it, we have one of the biggest messes that we can ever imagine. So that's our challenge. How do we take what we know, and I would argue, in miniature, in microcosm, that one of the best experiments and learning laboratories for how to do it isn't New York or London or Paris or Amsterdam or Toronto, but perhaps the best laboratory on how to do it is right here in our midst. Because it is the place that's doing it, And it's doing a lot of it right, and there are many things we can learn and improve. This is, the 21st century is the century of cities. The Economist wrote that man is shifting from being Homo sapiens to Homo urbanus. Cities are the fulcrum of our civilization, of our culture, and I would argue to you the motor force of our economy, economic competitiveness, technological innovation, and of economic and social development. When economists talk about what spurs economic growth and development, they'll typically talk about two key things. The first one is technology. Investing in technology, stimulating technological innovation, developing new things spurs economic growth and development. From Joseph Schumpeter to Karl Marx to the Nobel Prize-winning work of Robert Solow, technology and technological innovation drives us forward. Well, more recently, economists have concluded that it's not only technology that drives us forward. The accumulation of knowledge, in the words and writings of our colleague Paul Romer, the accumulation of knowledge and of human capital is a second key factor that spurs economic growth. But what most of us don't know and are only coming to understand is there's a third factor that spurs economic growth. And in our own research, we find that it is least as important as the first two, and that is urbanization. Places that are more urbanized, and as urbanization proceeds, urbanization has a big effect on economic growth and development, as does technological innovation and human capital accumulation. If a society wants to develop, if it wants more advanced innovations, if it wants more advanced culture, more highly educated people, that goes hand in hand with urbanization. Now, you know, all of this has confused people. It's confused people in the media, and it's confused a great many scholars. People, in the words of Mike Porter, the Harvard Business School professor, people who Mike Porter said should have known a lot better. Because when globalization started, this great globalization that we all represent here in Abu Dhabi, when globalization started, lots of people got confused as to the mechanism through which globalization would occur. Well, what did they see? They saw dramatic advances in transportation technology, particularly air linkages and air connections that would bring us together from many parts of the world, and in the words of the economists, lead to the death of distance. They saw the rise of new telecommunications technologies, the internet, social media, smartphones, and they said all of these things were making the world a smaller place and shrinking distance. In the words of Tom Friedman, the world is flat. The world is flat. In a flat world, you can plug and play from anywhere. You can live anywhere. You can be from any place. But is that really the way globalization has unfolded? Yes, of course, for simple manufacturing technologies and for standard business processes, they can be moved to virtually any corner of the world. But for the things that matter, for advanced technology, for knowledge accumulation, for scientific advanced, what we find that as the world spreads out, well, for every great force, there's an equally powerful counterforce, isn't there? As the world spreads out and disaggregates, globalization really occurs in an incredibly clustered and concentrated manner. The world is spiky on the world is flat on the one hand, but it is also spiky on the other. And the real motor forces of the world economy are becoming more clustered and more concentrated and more spiky than ever before. Just a few facts. If you take the world's 100 metropolitan areas, those are cities and their surrounding suburban hinterlands. There are more than 200 nations that the UN identifies. Just those 100 largest metro areas produced more than 50% of all global economic output. If you take just the top 20, each of them with a population of more than 10 million, they produce more than a quarter of all world economic output. Now, with the help of researchers at NYU, the University of Toronto and the Santa Fe Institute, because, as we've learned in our class, if you think about a lack in our world, while nations have national income accounts, and while nations collect economic statistics, and while you can tell the GDP of Abu Dhabi or Dubai or the United Kingdom or the United States or anywhere, you can't measure anything for global cities. Well, I went and visited the World Bank, I went and visited the IMF, I went and visited the UN, I went and visited all the think tanks, and no one had comparable and systematic data on how the world would look through the lens of cities and metropolitan areas. I think this is one of the single most important research and scientific efforts. So we did something very crude. My numbers are rough estimates, but here's how we solved the problem. You know those lovely pictures that you see in magazines or on your computer of the world at night, where you see the lights resonating off the Earth's surface, pictures taking great satellite images? We worked with just a couple of simple computer scientists. We didn't even have the remote sensors we need. We'll get them involved now in the next phase of this work to calibrate the images better. But we took those images of the world at night, and we used the light emissions, the energy emissions being refracted off the Earth's surface, to create estimates, not only of cities and metropolitan areas, but of economic activity for every square kilometer of the Earth's surface. And we wanted to do this because, in the words of the economist Vern Henderson, not only do we lack systematic data, the survey data that we do have is incomparable and biased. And even for many countries, the GDP data that we have, the economic output data that comes from surveys, is quite problematic. So at least it gives us some reasonably calibrated estimate of how cities and metropolitan areas perform in the world economy. And we did one other thing. We tried to identify not political or jurisdictional boundaries. We tried to identify the real economic units, the real market spaces, the real economic aggregates and agglomerations, conurbations that power the world economy. What we found is those are no longer just cities. Those are no longer cities and their suburban hinterlands. There's something we called, after the great economic geographer John Gottman, who coined this term megalopolis in the 1950s, we call them the megaregions. The megaregions are an economic aggregate like the great Boston, New York, Washington corridor. It's not China that's a rising economic competitor. It's the megaregion that stretches from Shanghai to Beijing. It's not India that's the economic powerhouse. It's the megaregions from Mumbai to Bangalore, and on and on and on. We found that the 40 largest megaregions in the world, which house less than 18% of the world's population, produce 2/3 of all economic output and 9 in 10 of all innovations. One of the great challenges of our time is that as clustering and concentration become more important and our world becomes spikier, we are not only divided by socioeconomic class, we are divided in our countries, not only divided across nations. We talk about this all the time in class. Those of us from Abu Dhabi or Dubai or the United Kingdom or China or India, Latin America, those of us who live in the spikes, we're more alike than ever. 2 generations ago, we were completely different. But now we wear the same clothes, we speak the same language, we drive the same cars, we live with the same kinds of houses and household products. But those who live outside the spikes are being left. If you want to understand the real fault lines of our political and social and cultural conflict, it's those who live in the shadows of the spikes. As one of my former students from China said, Professor Florida, with all respect, I'm from Shanghai, and as a young person in my 20s, I live better than you. But the people who live outside Shanghai live, in his words, in pre-civilized conditions. So the forces that are shaping our world and driving it forward are also creating these great divides. So how do we understand cities? How do we understand what they do? How do we move towards a social science, an urban science, and a science of cities? How do they act as motor forces of economic development? Well, our friends at the Santa Fe Institute, led by Jeffrey West, who are participating with us on a fabulous research project at NYU, have given us a theory. Their theory is very simple, is that cities grow because they speed up the pace of life. Well, you know this. You know this when you leave a small town or village and come to a bigger city and then end up in New York, and the pace of life goes faster and faster. In Jeffrey's words, cities are a unique kind of social and behavioral organism. In biological terms, as we get bigger, as we move from an ant to a mouse, to a cat, to a dog, to a bear, to an elephant, or we start to gain weight in middle age like me, our metabolic rate slows down. That's true of all biological entities. That's true of most of life, save for one kind of entity, a city, an urban organism. Because for a city to grow and develop, and their research shows this, its metabolism has to get faster. A city's metabolism superlinearly scales. As cities get bigger, if they don't get faster, they begin to die. Now why would that occur? Why would cities get faster? Well, it's true. We walk faster, and we talk faster, and we run around like crazy people, and we're always on. But what really would cause that? There's a woman who influenced me a lot. She didn't get a PhD. She came from Scranton, Pennsylvania. She went to work in New York City and started working at a magazine called The Architectural Record. And she started to look around her neighborhood, right around the square. And at the time, the wrecking balls of urban renewal, and this man, Robert Moses, was trying to run a superhighway through New York's Greenwich Village, and she was looking out on her street, Hudson Street. Her name was Jane Jacobs. I got to know her very well late in life. And Jane Jacobs wrote many classic books, The Death and Life of Great Cities, but as she approached her 80th birthday, a friend of mine asked her what she thought her greatest contribution was. And as simple as she was, and as basic as she was, she said, I think I figured something out that puzzled all these big-shot economists. She said, if you go back and you read your classical economists, you read your Smith, and you read your David Ricardo, and read your Joseph Schumpeter, you read your Alfred Marshall, read your Karl Marx. She said, all of these men, they had a very simple theory, the theory of the firm. Theory of the firm. And that theory of the firm says, as Adam Smith laid out in his classic example of the pin factory in early industrialization, if you want to make things better, you break down the jobs into simple elemental tasks. You create a more fine-grained division of labor. And then you add in, Frederick Taylor and the scientific management with the stopwatch, and then Henry Ford comes along and he adds the assembly line. She said, that's a really great theory of efficiency. That's a really good theory of how you make things cheaper and more efficient. She said, but that doesn't answer the question of economic growth, does it? This is a really smart, commonsensical lady. That doesn't answer the question of economic growth. For economic growth to occur, she said, you need to create new work. You need to do something new. You need to shift that curve. To create new work, you need technological innovation. She said, that doesn't come from companies, although companies can innovate at times. That comes from cities. Cities are the organizing point that creates innovation. It's not the firms that innovate, it's the cities. When people come together, when we come together in a city, when we form a team, well, what did Steve Jobs say about Apple? He was living there in Silicon Valley, and he was looking at all the innovations that were occurring, and they were looking at all the other startup companies, and they went and visited Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. Then they were looking and combining, and these companies were all competing for personal computers, and they were all competing in one place. And out of that came several great companies. When they asked this fellow, Jack White, he's a musician in a band that formed in Detroit, a very great band called the White Stripes. You may not have heard of them. They asked Jack White, what made Detroit a great music scene? He said the same thing that Steve Jobs said. He said, well, you have all these musicians, And they all want to make it. And they're combining and recombining into bands, and they're forming new combinations. And all of a sudden, one hits on a new sound, and then they get a new way of dressing, and they get a graphic designer. And out of that competition, in a place comes a new musical innovation. Well, it's been that way. Robert Lucas, when he accepted his Nobel Prize in economics, wrote an essay. He called it On the Mechanics of Economic Development. He said, if you want to understand where economic growth and development comes from, don't go back to your economics textbooks. Go right to the work of Jane Jacobs. He said, because Jane Jacobs really identified the motor force, the basic mechanism of economic development. He called it a human capital externality, and he gave it a twist. He called it a Jane Jacobs externality. What did he mean by that? He meant when people come together in a community, we make each other better. When we figure out how to work together in our little neighborhood or our little town or our big city, we come together and we not only innovate, we increase each other's productivity, which leads to this faster metabolism, which means that cities can get faster and grow bigger and develop. Cities are the basic social and economic organizing unit of our time. And what really screwed us up was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution really screwed us up. Because what we thought with the Industrial Revolution were these big, giant companies were the main force of economic growth. These big, multinational companies were the prime drivers of our economy, and they are so important. I don't mean to minimize their importance. But we thought in our theories of geography, in our theories of location, in our theories of cities, what made a city great was a location of companies. If we could just bring the companies in, we'll win. If we could just lure the companies with tax breaks and incentives, we're going to beat the economic race. If we can just build a giant cluster of companies. We now know companies are important, but the real economic glue that holds us together, the real social and organizing force of our time is the city. Now, when Jane Jacobs said this, they said she was nuts. The anthropologists went crazy, the archaeologists went crazy, the geographers went crazy, the economists went crazy. When Jane Jacobs said something heretical, cities precede agriculture. Cities, she said, were not only the economic and social force of her time, they were the economic and social organizing force of all time. Well, guess what our colleagues in anthropology and archaeology are finding out today? When they go back and look at the birth of what we call modern human civilization, when they look at the cave drawings and the birth of modern artistic expression, or the rise of the earliest development of simple and rudimentary tools. Guess where they find these leaps? Not in some giant expansion of brain capacity, unexplained. They find them in the densest human settlements of their time. Cities have always been the way we organize. We forgot that for a period, and we're beginning to get back to it now. And why is that? Because as our economy has begun this shift, it's been part of my own life's work. That is the shift that here in Abu Dhabi all of you have been working on. As our economies have begun this shift, this great epical shift that all of us are living through, as we've begun to shift from older, extractive, primary, basic, and industrial economies, organized around resources and large-scale capital improvements and giant ports and lots of physical labor power, to something new, we've now again begun to realize how important cities are. And I would submit, if cities have been important all along, they are the most important they've ever been now. Not only because we're putting millions upon millions of people in cities, not only because we will have to house millions of more people in cities in the greatest ramp-up of urbanization, but because cities are the key element to unlocking our post-industrial, service-based, and knowledge economy. You see, in my estimation, we are living through the greatest economic shift in all of human history. We might not recognize it, we might not notice it, we might not tap ourselves on the shoulder and say, wow, this is really a big thing we're going through, but we are. The last great shift, mega shift in our economy, came about a couple of centuries ago. When, well, in Italy, and of course in Holland, and then in England, and the United States, and others, we shifted from agriculturally based economies to industrially based economies. Now, think about how disruptive that shift was. It's the kind of thing Marx wrote about and other economists wrote about. It was massively disruptive to move agricultural populations from rural areas into cities. It was not only disruptive and caused widespread civil unrest, political unrest, revolutions. It caused massive financial and epochal depressions throughout the 18th and 19th and into the 20th century. Massive crises and conflict across the international system. 2 or 3 terrible global depressions, 2 world wars, not to mention numerous civil wars and civil strife. And in that period, we formed basic, small-scale industrial cities. The shift we are going through today is far larger and far deeper and far more far-reaching, because for the first time in human history, we have really changed the nature of the economic game. For all of human history before us, all of it, we made money, we created value, we built our societies, we generated wealth through physical assets. Either we were blessed, as in Abu Dhabi, with God-given natural resources like oil, or coal, or natural gas, or whatever, what have you. And we combine that in the Industrial Revolution with capital improvements and with physical labor power. The economist had a simple equation, right? If you wanted to grow and develop your economy, there were 3 factors of production to work with: land, labor, and capital. But over the course of the 20th century, and as we moved into the 21st century, this industrial thing, this physical asset thing, began to become less important to development, especially in the advanced countries. Not only did agriculture as a share of economic output decline, the share of direct industrial production as a share of economic output began to decline. And I don't want to bug you with many statistics. I know I burden my students with my books. They know this well. There'll be some for sale. But if you've read them, you know they're kind of tome-like. They have lots of statistics. And I always say if you want to have if you put them on your great bedside table, you'll have like a great 2 months of sleeping. But I just want to give you a few statistics of how big this shift is. The turn of the last century in the United States, more than 50% of the workforce worked on farms. A growing number worked in factories and industrial production. Less than 5% were members of a group I've dubbed the creative class. That's scientists, technologists, innovators, and entrepreneurs. That's knowledge-based professionals in management, in business, healthcare, and the law. And that's also artists, musicians, designers, entertainment, media people that make up the creative class. By the year 1950, in the United States, now more than 50% of the workforce was concentrated in industrial production, like my dad, with a 7th grade education, who excused himself, in fact, in the 7th grade in Newark, New Jersey, excused himself from the class and got his working papers on the day he turned 13. My dad worked in the same factory, Victory Optical, in the ironbound section of Newark, for his entire life, from the day he turned 13 to the day he could retire at 65. Less than 10% of us worked in the knowledge-based, idea-based creative class. Beginning in 1980, throughout the advanced world, we see a tectonic shift in our economic and industrial structures. In the United States alone, let's take the United States as just one case, 20 million new jobs established in the creative class. Knowledge-based professionals in management and business, healthcare and law, science, technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, and arts, culture, and creativity. Now in the United States, more than 40 million people work in the creative class, more than 1/3 of the workforce. Then projected as industrial jobs shrink to add another 10 million jobs over the course of the next decade. When unemployment rates among manufacturing workers surged past 10 and 15%, among construction workers surged past 20%, the mayor of Detroit, Dave Bing, said the unemployment rate in Detroit was over 50%. The rate of unemployment among knowledge workers and creative workers never topped 5%. Half of all wages and salaries paid, 3/4 of discretionary purchasing power. And, as our president, John Sexton, has told me, and how we got to know one another, the fact of the matter is that this creative and knowledge-based class, love them or not, cluster together. For all the reasons our friends at Santa Fe told us about urban metabolism, for all the reasons Steve Jobs located in Silicon Valley, for all the reasons Jane Jacobs told us about cities, the creative class is the most concentrated and clustered group of all. Not only do they represent more than 40 or 50% of the workforce in great cities, already topping the shares in the blue-collar class before them, in some parts of great conurban whether that be New York or London or Paris or Milan, they are over 85 or 90% of the workforce. If agriculture is shrunk as a percent, as a share of our workforce, more than 50% in the 1900s, shrinking down to 20% by 1910 or 20, by 10% by 1930, 5, 6, 7% by 1940 or 50, to less than 1% today. Guess how many people in the United States actually make things today? Less than 5%. Less than 5%. Across the world, across the advanced industrial world, but now across the world more generally, as agriculture becomes more efficient, as manufacturing becomes more automated and better organized, the role of knowledge, of ideas, of science, of technology, of entrepreneurship, of innovation, and creativity grows, not only in the advanced world, but across the world. And this is the great experiment happening here. But when it comes to city building, when it comes to creating great cities and great communities, when it comes to the factors that promote and stoke economic development, it causes us to change the way we think. If you had asked my peers, if you had asked me 20 years ago, what were the things that cities and communities could do to stoke economic development, we would have told you that's easy. Figure out the best package of tax incentives you can have to lure companies to your jurisdiction. And if you could lure companies to your jurisdiction, whether that be a surrounding city in your home country, a surrounding province or state, or another country, if you could figure out how to get a branch plant and a grouping of branch plants, a cluster of branch plants, you would get economic development. Why? Because, of course, we know where the companies are is where the jobs are, is where the people come. Well, over the past couple of decades, that equation has started to change. Jobs are certainly still important. People need to have economic opportunity, but having a strong business sector and a strong business climate alone is not enough. Not even as having a great physical infrastructure. Now, clearly in our day and age, and it's something this region benefits from, clearly in our day and age, having a great physical infrastructure is important. Having world-class ports is critical. Having spectacular airports, as we do in Abu Dhabi and nearby in Dubai. An enormous advantage. I've conducted research on the role of airports in economic development. They are critically important. They add as much value as having a high-tech cluster of firms, comparatively speaking. But even having a great physical infrastructure and a great business climate, those are necessary but insufficient conditions to really be a world-class global city. In doing my research that became the book Rise of the Creative Class, when I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon University, I learned a big lesson. I was watching at Carnegie Mellon, one of America and the world's premier technological institutes. I actually did the calculations and found that at Carnegie Mellon, in terms of per faculty productivity, whether that be engineering and science publication, whether that be research and development dollars per head, or startup companies per faculty, Carnegie Mellon was producing on par with MIT, which had given rise to the technology complex of the greater Boston area, was producing on par with Stanford that had stimulated the Silicon Valley. I watched company after company that was launched in Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, move away. And one day, when I was coming off leave at Harvard and MIT, I came back to my students, from whom I always learned the most, at Carnegie Mellon, and I asked them, when you graduate, what are you going to do for a living? Where do you think you want to do that? And how many of you young people will stay in Pittsburgh? And when I asked how many would stay in Pittsburgh, not a hand went up. And they were going to go to New York, or they were going to go to San Francisco, or the Silicon Valley, or they were going to go to Boston, or Austin, Texas. And I said, why? They said, well, I could have a good job here in Pittsburgh. I could have a great job here in Pittsburgh. In fact, they'd pay me a lot of money, and housing is cheap. But it just doesn't have the same thing that we talk about in class. It just doesn't have energy. And remember, my students were not talking about low-cost electric power. When they were talking about energy, they were talking about human energy. And I was like, my head was spinning. I'm like, are you guys crazy? Don't you just go like me where the job is? They're like, no, you're old. And we began this now decade-long project on trying to figure out what these kids meant when they said they move to energy. And then it dawned on me. It's not just that people move to jobs, but look at us. All of us here in Abu Dhabi, from all over the world, we're mobile. It's not just capital that's mobile and people like from the local place go for a job there, like my dad. We get to pick, especially if we're highly educated and we have opportunity. We get to pick where we want to live. And at first I thought all these young people wanted to go to a place that had great nightlife and lots of clubs and lots of leisure activity. But the more I probed it, what they were saying is that when they said energy and excitement, they meant a place that had economic and social and civic opportunity. Opportunity across the board. A place that had a thick labor market with lots of job opportunities, not just one. A place where they could meet and make friends. And in my research, I say often, I try to help my colleagues who don't quite get this and practitioners who struggle with it, I say, I know jobs are important, but if my dad told me, getting a good job, going to school, getting an education, but my mom gave me better advice. She said, pick the right girl. What's more important in your life? Well, where are the economists? Wake up, guys. The mating market that exists in a city where people meet each other and stoke up friendships and find each other. It's a critically important part. And every person said, even if they went for that job after a year or two, if that mating market, if that group of other people that they could date and get to know and make friends with, not everyone was going to get married in 2 years, but they were looking for other people like themselves. If that wasn't right, no matter how good the job was, they left. So I was shaking my head. I said, this is crazy. And I was turning 40 at the time, and I said, well, let's look at it. My parents made a big investment in me. The state of New Jersey made a big investment in me. The National Science Foundation and philanthropic foundations made a big investment in me. Universities made a big investment in me. I got to try to figure out what's really going on. So I took my field and turned it up on its head. And oh my God, when I did that, you should have seen the onslaught of my friends became my critics. And well, I've been accused of everything. You know, I've been accused of everything under the sun. But I'll tell you, and I said, not only for our academic purposes, but this is an important thing. And at that point, I was just looking at economic development of little towns like Pittsburgh and Cleveland. I never imagined I'd be here in Abu Dhabi talking to you guys and talking about global cities. But over the course of that next decade, the things that I was unraveling became important not only to the economic growth and development of cities in one country, but around the world. Well, here's what I found. Here's what I found. Cities don't even just need a great business climate. Business climate they need. They need transparency, all the things you've achieved here. Transparency, good regulation, open standards. They want to have a good tax regime, all of those things. Not only a good infrastructure for businesses of roads and ports and shipping. Just as important as that business climate is a people climate. A people climate. And the way I'd phrase it to you is every one of these remarkable people who come here to this city in search of opportunity, in search of a better salary, in search of a great education, what we call in the economic business, we say we want to retain and attract, retention and attraction of firms. Every single one of those people is an attraction and retention opportunity. And one of the great things is where the real talent clusters in our world is universities. Universities are the hub. They're the critical hub of this creative and knowledge-based economy. Not only here, what happened in New York? You know, arguably the most powerful economic city on the planet, vying with London. What did the mayor say he had to do? He had to invest in scientific and technological capacity to build up the scientific and technological infrastructure on that island in the greatest city in the world. It matters across the board. Universities are key to this. And then I began to try, slowly at first, to unpack what the heck is a people climate. That's what we're working on in class, right, guys? And we're working on it right here with relevance to this city. Through their eyes, through our eyes, what is the people climate that we could build here in Abu Dhabi? Well, we first concluded the infrastructure is spectacular. The roads are terrific. The beach walk is magnificent. But what else? And also, I mentioned the airport infrastructure, the fact that there are two great cities in the region that can leverage Abu Dhabi and Dubai and have complementary skill sets. All of those things. But the first thing they said was what my research was uncovering. Intuitive research coming together. What are the elements of that people climate? So I created this goofy thing in my book. I said to myself, my mom was pretty simple. And because she had a high school degree, she's the one who taught me, because my father couldn't. He couldn't teach me trigonometry or advanced math. My mom could help me. Barringer High School. And she always drummed in my head this ridiculous English saying, the 3 R's. Only one has an R, reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's so ridiculous. So I said, well, if I'm going to write this book, I've got to make it so I can communicate with my mom. So I called it the 3 T's. Technology. If you want to grow a great global city, you've got to be a technology leader. You've got to have great technology companies, you've got to invest in technology innovation, you've got to build a technology infrastructure, you've got to be wired for the future, you've got to have a great airport, you've got to really do all those things that make great universities and science innovation. But I watched in Pittsburgh. We had every one of those things. We had several great universities, Carnegie Mellon, the University of Pittsburgh, we had Westinghouse, we had US Steel, we had Gulf Oil, we had Rockwell International Aerospace, we had R&D on top of R&D on top of R&D, and it was all just flowing away. As the city's population went from 900,000 to 700,000 to 600,000 to 500,000 before it stopped dropping at 350,000. So the second T I figured out is we need talent. We need talented people. And what I came to conclude is when I'm talking about talent, I wasn't just talking about great primary and elementary schools. You see, I learned that California figured this out. California didn't invest a whole lot in its primary and secondary school, but it pumped a heck of a lot of money in its colleges and universities. And its dirty little secret was that it could attract really bright people, not only from California, but from all over the world. It would attract people from India and the Arab nations and from China and from all over the United States and from all over the world to its universities, the talented people, because not only was technology mobile, talent was mobile. And what did I see in Pittsburgh? It wasn't only the technology that was flowing away, it was the talented people. And then I came out with my third T. It's the one I take a lot of grief for. Tolerance. Tolerance. Openness. Diversity. The fact that everyone can feel comfortable and feel like they can have a go. My discovery that places that had thriving arts and bohemian, my bohemian factor, thriving arts and bohemian communities had a spark. And often where the artistic and bohemian community was, very quickly, whether that was San Francisco or Seattle or Austin, very quickly that technology, why? Not because artists were entrepreneurs, not because artists developed technology, because places that artists and outsiders could mobilize resources and find a way of life. They had the same ecosystem characteristics. They had the same locational vibe, if you will, that would enable an entrepreneur to be successful. Openness, technology, talent, and tolerance. Silicon Valley, the beacon of the world for high technology, the one everyone wants to be, a Silicon Prairie, a Silicon Desert, a Silicon Lake, a Silicon this, a Silicon that. What's the fact? 50% of the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were born in a country other than the United States. It is a magnet for global talent. Technology, talent, and tolerance. And then I wrote the book, and I began to work with lots and lots of urban planners in cities around the world. And my colleagues told me, I hesitate even to say it, they told me I had to add a fourth T. My mother, if she was still with us, she wouldn't be happy, but I added the fourth T, and they called it the territorial characteristics, but it's really not a T. It's the quality of the place. Quality of place. What makes a great city, what makes a global city, what creates a talent magnet, of course the university plays a role in creating what our leader, John Sexton, calls an idea capital. I tell this to cities all over the world now. I don't care how fancy you are. I don't know how much glitz and glitter. We spend part of the winter, or in the United States in Miami Beach. I preach this there. I don't care how much glamour factor you have. If you're not an idea capital, you're not going anywhere. You need to be a great global city. You need to create ideas. It's not just enough to create business and to create wealth. There is something in a great global city that its idea, its scene, its narrative is a critical part of the mix, and universities are the hub of that. But it also turns on quality of place. The two go hand in hand. That's why so many kids across the world are being drawn to urban places to study. Quality of place, not quality of life. Notice I used a different word. Quality of place. When I was young and I was coming up and I was talking about economic development, talking to people all over the world about that, they said we need quality of life. If we attract those companies and we get those great companies, we need a quality of life for the families that have to relocate. Quality of life was a code word for good schools and low crime. Really important. Well, here are the statistics. Another NYU faculty member, Eric Kleinberg, figured this out, a book called Going Solo. Across the advanced world, for better and worse, fewer and fewer people get married. Many of us get married later in life, and many of us are single. In the advanced world, only about half of adults are married at any given point. That means half of adults are single or solo. Only about a quarter of adults have children living with them in the home. So if the people climate is just about good schools and low crime and suburban living style, well, that's a great competitive edge for 25%. But what about the other 75%? They need something else. And so what I wrote in the book is that quality of place has to offer something for everyone. Somebody who's in college age and is single and looking to make friends. Somebody who's after college and is looking for a vibrant social and economic scene. Wants to try out a variety of jobs. Wants to try out a place where they can meet and mingle and make friends. A person who's a young couple who might want to live in a dense urban district, but when they have children, would want to shift to having more space. And then, I said in my book, who's your city? The place you choose to live is the most important decision you'll make in your life, because it structures all the others. It structures how your career is going to go. It structures how your social life's going to go. It helps you meet the people you might date and eventually marry. But you make three big locational choices in your life. One, when you leave college and university and you get that first job. Places that attract college kids have a huge advantage because people at age 25 are 5 times more likely to move than someone my age. So the math is, if you can attract them at that age, you're a winner. You make another big move when, not only when you get married, but when they're kids, and you're looking for all of the things that go with having a family. And then when the kids leave the nest and you're an empty nester. 3 big moves. And so places have to offer something, maybe not in the same neighborhood, maybe not in the same community, but in the same metro region or mega region. They have to offer something, as Jane Jacobs said, great cities are really federations of great neighborhoods. Great cities equal great neighborhoods. So that's the key. And what is its characteristics? Quality of place. Well, the first thing is what's there. What is the natural environment? The sea, the dunes, the wonderful natural environment, the sun. How can you harness that asset? And the built environment. What is there in the built environment? The infrastructure, the buildings, the density. And we know that greater densities mean greater economic growth. So it's partly the natural and built environment, but that's not enough. Boy, and Abu Dhabi has done spectacularly well there. The second thing is who's there. And that's what we pick up in our class. Who's using the space? What are the mix of activities in the space? How is that? And that's where urban planning has fallen down, frankly. We can tell you how to build infrastructure. We can tell you what a master plan looks like. But this whole thing that is coming up now of place making, that's a struggle for us. How do you make great places? Who's there? What is the diversity of peoples? And then what's going on? What are the activities that animate? What's there? Who's there? What's going on? That creates the energy. That creates the people climate. So with the Gallup organization, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was able to design a survey, a very large-scale survey. We've now implemented this survey on tens of thousands of people in the United States and hopefully in the future all over the world, because Gallup has polling capability all over the world. And we wanted to know not only what makes a city rich, not only what makes a city wealthy, we wanted to know what makes a city or a community a place where citizens and residents really want to be. Think about the experiment here. In building a city, not only where people want to come to work, but where people want to stay. What are those characteristics that create emotional attachment to a town? No one had ever thought about this. So we probed this and developed a large-scale instrument implemented on a whole randomized sample of individuals and households. What we ended up with was something that in the end looked like what they call a Maslow pyramid, a hierarchy of needs. Now, you know this in our world. When we're a small village society, we're not very wealthy, basically subsistence is our priority. We've got to put food on the table. We're hunting, we're gathering, we're using the water and the land to feed our families. So basic economic things really drive survival needs. And as we get a little bit better, we can begin to develop new capacities and new needs till we develop a mature, in post-industrial affluent society where we get these, what they call transcendental. We quest aesthetics and better art and more beauty in our lives. We try to make our lives better. We focus on design. We try to develop ourselves. For cities and towns and communities, we found a very similar pattern. At the bottom of the pyramid, a necessary but insufficient condition was that you had basic opportunity, that people could come to the town and find a job. And what I said, not only find a job, but in our society, when they have to switch jobs and mobility is so important, there were a number of jobs that they could switch between. And because people, if they're married, they have to find a job for each partner. So it's not just a job for the guy. There needs to be a job for the two partners in a relationship or in a union. So it needed a job market and a labor market of opportunity. It needed basic services. It needed great roads. It needed a good airport. Needed great crime and safety, all the things that we call the basics, and that's where most urban planners stop. They say if you have opportunity, economic opportunity, and you have crime and safety and great roads, you're done. But there were two things at the top of the pyramid that were the two things that defined emotional attachment. It wasn't the roads, it wasn't the infrastructure, it wasn't just the safety and security, those were important. It wasn't just the opportunity. If you really wanted people to be attached to your town, if you wanted them to choose your town, and not only do companies have a multiplier, people have a multiplier. When you move to a place and choose it, sooner or later, your friends and family start to follow you. So it's a multiplier effect. It's not only the emotional attachment of an individual, it's the multiplier effect of getting more and more people to want to come there. And we know that, especially with quote-unquote immigrant communities, that the immigrant communities grow as part of a network and attract others from their society to the same community. There were two factors that predominated. Second from the top was valuing openness and diversity. It makes sense, really. If we're coming from all over the world to a place, and we're trying to make a go of it, we want to know that we can succeed, whether we're a man or a woman, regardless of our ethnic or religious or our cultural background, our sexual orientation. We want to know that we can be part of the place. So the more open a place was, the more diverse a place was, the more the emotional attachment of all citizens. Not just one group or a dominant group. The more open and diverse and tolerant and inclusive, the more the emotional attachment of the entire town. And then the top-ranked factor, the aesthetic character of the place, the quality of the place itself. The quality of the place itself, the way it treats its natural environment, its sustainability, its parks, its green space, its bike lanes, its pedestrian corridors. Pedestrian corridors and bike lanes and all of that indicated energy and excitement. Its built environment. Its built environment. The way it values its present, its future, its investment in great architecture, but preservation of the past. And I know this is a new city, but this is important. Jane Jacobs said something very profound, and it means preserving the past wherever we can. She said, new ideas require old buildings. Now, that's easier in an ancient city with a lot of ancient ruins and old buildings, but it means wherever there is the old and the original and the authentic, in a world where we're assaulted by so much that's the same, we look in places for the authentic. So it was the combination of the built and the natural and the offerings and the social and cultural and entertainment and energized offerings and not just high culture. Of course, high culture, symphonies and operas and ballets are important, but the street-level scenes, the street-level activity, the local activity that created the real energy, those were the key factors. Well, I'm running short on time. I want to take a few questions. And as a professor, my students sometimes say I can talk a lot. Professors, you know, they come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking. We go on and on. But I want to end with the challenge on which I started. And why I think it's so important what we're doing here, not only to build Abu Dhabi, and we're going to help, and we're committed. I'm committed. Our students are committed. NYU is committed. This isn't just a one-off. We're going to continue to do this. We care about it. My wife and her family come from this region. They come from Jordan. It's something we're very committed. And of course, it's about this city. But it's about something bigger. Remember I told you we're going to put billions of people in cities over the course of the next 20 or 30 years. Think about that. Not every place in the world has anywhere near the resources of Abu Dhabi. They don't have the God-given natural resources that you're blessed with. Not every place in the world has the good governance that you have, and the vision, and the leadership, and has done all the things. Many of the places that are urbanizing now have what we call the weak states. They have very little in the way of governance, and they're rife with civil conflict. If you look around the world, they don't have a professional class of city managers, of city planners, of urban planners, and they can't afford to get them. Now we're going to put several trillion people in cities. We're putting 10,000 people an hour in urban areas. You know how much money we're going to spend on city building over the next several decades? Hundreds of trillions. So we can do it right or we can do it wrong. We can take this opportunity not only as a city, but as a world, and we can make it more efficient and more effective. It is the grandest challenge of our time. So I know that we want to develop new industries and new business models. But man, think of this one. If we could develop the formula together, here in Abu Dhabi, in New York, and all the other places, London and around the world, in Shanghai, if we who are so blessed and advantaged could develop that formula, and not just a formula for buildings and roads, a formula for building quality of place, for real placemaking, for real creative placemaking, for placemaking more energetic and exciting. If we can develop the science and the curriculum, if we can develop the training tools, we'll not only make ourselves better, we have done the world the greatest service in modern memory. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
I was wondering what you think the most effective means of addressing sustainability concerns in cities would be from an investment standpoint.
Well, I think we have two things that we have to conserve or harness. And so I have a little broader definition of sustainability. I think in our societies we waste two things terribly. The one is the obvious one. We're just terribly awful at wasting our natural resources. We have to do better at that. What's happening at Masdar here is a great step in that direction. But we also have to make sure we use our human talent. And I think that we can no longer afford to waste. I mentioned the divide. So I think one of the things we have to do is make sure that we invest in the creative capabilities of all our people. So the sustainability of preserving our natural resources, but when I think of sustainability, I think of sustainability of our human resources. And I like to say that every single human being is creative, and we have to harness all of human creative capabilities. But when building our cities, we have to build cities that harness the human and the natural.
Out of the 3 T's and the quality of place that you were talking about, how would you rate Abu Dhabi on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the best? And
you have to wait 1 more week. And I promise we will give you an answer. It's actually the exercise that we are currently going through in our seminar. I think it's, without giving you the 0 to 10,
okay.
I think it's the next phase of urban development here. I think all of the physical infrastructure and physical planning, and we talk about this even in contrast to Dubai, which we admire, but the physical plan here is spectacular with the grid and the street layout. Now the next step is the placemaking and the creative placemaking and the energizing. And once you've got the physical part right, it's not a big step. And I actually think, you know, my pushy American way, sorry, apologizing to everyone here, my pushy American way thinks, what better place to develop the formula for placemaking than here? It is the laboratory experiment. It is the place that we could do it. And what's hard about it is that in old cities, this happens organically. It happens over decades and decades and decades of populations moving in and energizing a city. We don't have decades. We don't have decade. So here you could begin to see what are the factors that create that human energy and how to begin to make that, I don't want to call it a formula, but how to make that part of our planning process. So I think that's our next agenda. And if you drop me a card or send me your email, I'll be happy to give you at least our answer in a week or so.
I'm just wondering, what is your view on the non-creative, by using your term for the creative, and what is the city's responsibility and its role in making sure that they are included as well in this fast-paced development?
So
yeah.
every single human being is creative, and the real challenge and opportunity is to harness that creativity. If a third or 40% or 50% in the most advantaged cities have the great good fortune, like most of us, to have knowledge-based and creative jobs, I often say the smartest people, the brightest people, the most capable people I met were growing up in New Jersey, and they were left behind. So the big challenge of our time is to harness that creative energy of the people who are currently working in the service class. We actually came up with a metric in class. We'd love to get the numbers for Abu Dhabi, but what we did was take the advanced countries and advanced cities and figure out for every knowledge worker or creative workers how many lower wage service workers a community has. For every 1 knowledge worker, 1.5 service workers are needed. I believe the most important force of addressing inequality in our time is not simply education or more manufacturing jobs. It's lifting the capabilities and the innovation and the creativity of the service workers. I believe this is the most important thing that challenges our advanced countries. So it means harnessing more and more of those creative capabilities because every single human being is creative. We can't, going back to sustainability, we can't afford to waste any human talent any longer.
My question kind of combines the last two. So obviously we're living in a world where we want more and more, and especially, like you said, the 1 or the 10%, we want more things, and that comes from somewhere. And although these people might have creative energy, it's very hard to harness that creative energy when they work 15 hours to provide us with other things that we want and we need. So I guess how would you harness this creative energy for those people? And then also, what is a city that you think has exemplified this harnessing of the creative energy of the service class?
Nowhere. Nowhere. I think we're left in a debate which believes that service work is low wage, low skill, undignified work. Now, in the developing world, huge percentages of people do this work. In the advanced world, 50% of the workforce does this work. There was a time when we thought the same of manufacturing work. When they said that manufacturing work was terrible work, it was done by immigrant people who nobody cared about, people, William Blake called it life in the satanic mills. But we learned if we wanted to build middle-class societies, we had to give manufacturing workers a decent wage in the advanced world. We built a social compact that said that those workers would have a decent wage, and in having a decent wage, they could build a decent life and for better and worse, consume that stuff. Now we sit in our world and we think that this is a natural law by which those of us who happen to have good education or are heavily entrepreneurial or have artistic success deserve something great and everyone deserves less. No, we're going to have to make those jobs better jobs, and we're going to have to make them more productive and innovative and harness creative capabilities. We need a new social compact. But that social compact, I believe, is going to start in our cities. And I would hope that it would start in our most advanced cities. And I would hope that it would start in places like New York and London and Toronto, where they have the means and the mechanisms to begin to do that. But that's something now we have to build and we have to advocate for, because only by doing that will we harness those capabilities, increase living standards, and increase economic development in a reasonably virtuous circle.
One thing particular to Abu Dhabi, I mean many things, but one thing that's particular here is that the population is here for a certain number of years, yes. 4 years, 5 years, 7, 10 maybe. And there is another thing is that, I see that you're talking to your students, so that's not a secret. Another thing is that very few people retire here.
Yep.
So how is it that you're going to have a different approach about, you know, building the city of Abu Dhabi, and are you going to be able to take that example as a template to be doing it in places like Toronto or New York?
Well, here's what I would say. This is a question, this is not mine to decide. I can only be make helpful suggestions. This is a question for the leadership of Abu Dhabi. But if Abu Dhabi really wants to become a post-industrial city, if Abu Dhabi really wants to become a knowledge and creative-based city, if Abu Dhabi really wants to attract and retain talent, it has to change that. That's the next step. Now, we have to say, what's been accomplished here is remarkable. And it's happened in a relatively short period of time compared to anywhere in the global north or the advanced industrial world. What has happened here in half my life, half the time I've been on this earth, has been this remarkable economic development and the creation of a very sophisticated, cosmopolitan, advanced city. The next step is the step that you say. What will it take to attract and retain and create permanence and emotional attachment? And I would submit, humbly, that if that doesn't occur, economic development can't occur. So it's your choice. Your choice, but if that doesn't occur, economic development will not be what you want it to be. You've reached a constraint. You've reached a limiting factor. So those would be the next step in the economic development planning and strategy of Abu Dhabi.
The question is kind of in 3 parts, and you've talked about what's going to happen in the next 20 to 30 years, and we all know it's urbanization at a massive rate. But there are certain problems that need solutions, and what you kind of touched upon briefly, I want to find out what you are thinking of as a solution to global governance, because the states that we've had for 200 years fail, and they fail to govern world and global corporations, and they fail to govern cities. And transportation is going to change, and it's going to impact airports that you talk about over the next 50 years. How is world going to change, in your opinion, because of that? And then third, there's... But the basic fact of urbanization is that it's taking up land, that's agricultural land, that's required to feed us. Yep. What is a solution there? And land is becoming a very, very scarce commodity.
So 3 things really quickly. On the first, I learned that hopefully through being exposed to an incredible range of global students and scholars who helped me navigate that world. And I honestly believe that with we were talking about this today, with NYU's platform of the global hubs and the global campuses, I was saying that this is the greatest gift a scholar could ever want. Because you're not just a tourist and coming in for a couple of days with 1 or 2 researchers, you can find the ability to live and immerse in a place in a way that is amazing for this kind of research. So that's how I try to tackle that, and I don't do it very well. I do it as best I can. The second part was about rapid urbanization and how that might occur. That was actually the third part. I want to come back to the second question last. Look, capitalist development occurs not only through intensification of labor, but intensification of the use of space. That's the way capitalist development occurs. I'm smart enough to have learned that we're not going to break, like some of my utopian friends, we're not going to sort of break with capitalism tomorrow. We're going to have to learn how to use capitalism to develop better social and economic outcomes for people and places. Part of that is the intensification of the use of space, and not only the intensification of space in the core, the extensification and outward movement of space. We have to do that better, which leads me to my third question. How do we govern it? There's one book title I wish I came up with. And a fellow named Ben Barber, a political theorist, came up with this title. He calls his book, which will release soon, If Mayors Ruled the World. That's where we have, and not just saying if mayors ruled the world, it would be better. You're dealing with a situation now where mayors who govern cities, mayors and councils and community and city-based organizations are amongst the most important economic entities in the world, and they have no support structure. Business leaders and business professionals have an extensive set of business schools and executive training and professional development, in-house development. They can learn how to be more effective, whether we like that or not. For national leaders and nation-state leaders, for security professionals and defense professionals and whatever, there's an extensive network of training and development. What exists for the leadership, elected leadership and city builders? Nothing. That is something we have to build. We have to make our field, urban planning, city building, and placemaking, a professional global field with real resources, and we don't have 100 years to do it. We have 10 or 20 years to do it, and that's what we have to do. I'm delighted that NYU wants to play a role in it. Why doesn't Harvard? Where is Harvard? Where is Yale? Where is MIT? I can go down the list. They have tiny little urban planning programs. Where are our major philanthropic foundations? Where are our transnational organizations? Why don't we have programs? I don't know, but we have to build them. Why can't we build them that would be digital and online and toolkits that would give people the ability to learn with? I meet mayors all the time. I spend tons of time with mayors. I give talks like this, and they'll say something like, I wish I kind of knew that when I started office. If I knew that, I would be more effective. That's a 1-hour talk. Imagine if we could build the real curricula. So that's the challenge of our time, how to take our field of urban planning and city building and placemaking and not only make it something that's an academic discourse, that's something that we talk about how important it is, that's something that we can ramp up and roll out very quickly as world urbanization occurs.
Thank you. It was a wonderful talk, a wondrous talk, some great questions, and I know there were more, but we want to be easy on Richard because we want him to come back. So please do join us, and he said he's willing to talk to you outside. He's signing some books. I think there are about 16 books there for you to purchase and get signed. Do join us at the reception.